Hello and welcome to part 21 of our video series on building a Node, Express and Postgres based API. Today we're going to carry on our work on authenticating users, and today we're going to be building an authentication handler for a new route that we'll end up adding in a future video, which is going to be for when somebody submits a form with an email address and password. It'll authenticate the user and return an authentication token as well as a representation of that user to the front end. So we've got a couple of things that we'll do today. One is to add the authentication handler, and then we'll add some unit tests to the code as well. If you want to follow along, there's a link in the video description to the GitHub repository that we're working from, and the branch that we're working from today is called Part 21 Start. So if you check that out, you'll have all the code that we have up here, and you'll be able to work along with me. One thing before we get started, I did notice between the last video and now that there is actually a failing unit test, which is bad of me. I should have caught it in the last video. But if we run npm run unit test, we'll notice there's actually an error which comes from a small change that we made in the previous video to the response shape of this user handlers.create user function. So what we're going to do is we're just going to head over to the root unit test file here. I'm just going to update this test because it's actually not a it's not actually accurate to what it does. So when validation passes, call user handler.create user. Yeah, so we'll do that. And what's actually happening is we've changed the create user response shape from this to be a user and a token. So when it's trying to destructure that here, because this function is mocked out, a mock by default will return an undefined value. It's trying to destructure an undefined, which is what's giving us our type error. So what we need to do is we'll just need to, I'm just going to grab this here. We'll just need to mock out that function response before we call the function, or before we call this create user router. So we'll do user handlers, and it's get, so it's create user dot mock resolved value, and what it's going to be returning is a token, which we'll just have as a string, and it's going to be returning a user, which we don't really care what the shape of the user is at this point, because it's just testing the actual interaction with that function. So we'll update it so it just turns back an empty object for a user. And we'll run our test again, and we'll just check, make sure that works. And it does, and we're back to a clean set of running unit tests, which is good. So what we'll do is we'll carry on now, and we'll start the work that we're going to be doing on our Authenticate User handler. So we'll add a new handler function, which is going to be Authenticate User. It's going to take a request, which is an express request. And what we're going to do, there's a few steps that we're going to want to run through when authenticating user. One, we're going to want to go and see if the email address that's passed in with a request, that we can find a user within the database for that email address. If we can't, then we're going to want to throw an error. If we can find a user, but the password that the user has supplied doesn't match the one that we have in the database, we're also going to want to throw an error. But if those constraints are met, then we're going to want to create an authentication token and return that back so that the root handler can return that to the front end. So what we'll do first of all is we'll create a const user equals await user store.get user by email, and we'll pass in the rec.body.email, and then what we'll do is if there's no user, we'll throw new HTTP error 400 invalid email address or password. And then what we'll also do is when we save passwords into our database, we save them as hashes, and we use this bcrypt.js library to hash the passwords. So what we'll need to do is we'll just need to be able to compare those a plain text password with the hashed password that we have in the database, and we can use our compare sync function to be able to do that, and that's from the bcrypt.js library. So what we'll do is compare sync rec.body.password, and then we'll compare that to user.password. And what this will do is it will take this plain text password submitted from the front end, and it'll compare it with the hashed password that we have in our database. And what you'll notice is we'll actually keep the error message the same for whether a user exists or doesn't, or whether the password is invalid. Because what you don't want to do is send a different response back if we found the user but the person submitting the form has submitted the wrong password, because that'll give information out to anybody that's making requests against your system that yes, that user exists on our system, so keep trying different passwords until you get in. So we'll obfuscate it and just have the same error message for both errors here. Once those constraints are met, then what we'll do is we'll create an authentication token equals create authentication token, and that will take in a user ID. And what that will return, that we then need to return to the calling function here, is we'll return an object, and it's going to have a token, which is going to be the authentication token.token, and it's going to have a user, which is going to be the user from above here. So just to recap, we'll get a request in that'll come in from the front end. It'll have an email address and password on it. We'll go and try and find that user. If we can't find them, or if the password that they've supplied is not the same as the one that we have on file, we'll throw an error that we can then surface back to the front end. But if all that passes, we'll create a new authentication token in our database, and we'll return that so that that can be sent back to the front end application so that they can use authentication token in future requests. So now that we've got that done, what we'll do is we'll go into our handler unit tests here, and we're actually going to start creating a few different unit tests to cover off those different scenarios. So we'll just copy this describe block, and we'll just get the function name, authenticate user. And we're going to have a couple of different test cases. So the first one is going to be throws an error if the email provided does not match a user on our in our database, and we're going to test that by first simulating a request. So we'll create a temporary user here. We'll create a request, and the body of that request is going to be email, which is going to be user.email, and then password, which is going to be user.password. So I'll just remove those two there because we don't need them. And then what we will do is we'll mock out the call to the user store to get user by email. So I'm just going to grab this. .get user by email. .mock resolved value undefined. So what that'll mean is that whenever this get user by email function is called, it'll just return undefined, and it'll be that'll be enough for our function. And then we'll write an assertion block that says expect, and then we'll have user handlers dot authenticate user, pass in that request, dot rejects dot throw, and then we'll have new HTTP error 400 invalid email address or password. So that will cover the case where we don't find a user within the database. So let's run that test, and that's passed OK. So what we're going to do next is we'll just take that same testing block here. Just copy that one there. So throws an error if the password provided does not match a found user's password in our database. So what we're going to do is we are going to what we'll do is we'll just update this mock resolve value for this get user by email, and we'll just get it to return this user so that it gets it past that kind of first block. And then what we're going to have to do as well is we'll just have to update bcrypt.js.compareSync.mock return value, and then we'll say that they don't match, so it's going to return false for them not matching. So we're going to mock out this bcrypt.js function compareSync, and the reason we can do that is because at the top of our file we have this jest.mock done up here so that we can mock that value out. So what we're going to do, we're just going to run our unit tests again, make sure that those pass, and then what we've got is we've got 2 lines left within our code coverage that we need to cover, which are line 35 to 37. So we can see that the code coverage has covered all of these lines here so far, and we've just got this case here to deal with, which is the actual success response. So what we'll want to do is we'll grab this one here, and then we'll just update the entire message, and we'll just say returns an authentication token and a user when all checks pass. So what we'll do is we will switch this over to true, so that we say for this test compareSync will say the passwords are the same. And then what we'll do is we need to mock out this function here as well, this create authentication token function. So we'll just need to mock that out. So we'll just grab this, we'll say require create authentication token dot mock resolved value, and then we'll have token, which will just be a authentication token. If I could spell. There you go. So we'll just get it to return a mock authentication token for when that one's created. And then what we'll do is we'll just change this to an asynchronous test, because we're going to do const res equals await user handlers dot create authentication dot authenticate user. And then what we want to do is we're going to want to now assert against this response. So what we'll do is we'll do expect res dot res dot token dot to be expect dot any string. So I believe that'll just give us an assertion that it's a string value that's returned. Let's have a look. So it's actually said that it's undefined. So let's have a look at why it's doing that. So we've got create authentication token, takes in a user ID, and it runs. Oh, yeah, we've got a small typo there. That might explain why it's undefined. Oh, it's still failing. So we've got. Let's have a look. So got authentication, create authentication token. Let's have a quick look. Oh, that's in the wrong test file. So we've got authentication token generator dot create authentication token dot mock resolved value. Oh, do we mock these out at the top? Yeah, no, we've got the mocks there. So let's have a look. Expect res dot token dot to be. Okay, so what we do in a scenario like this is we'll just start adding some console logs just to have a look and see what's going on. Console.log authentication token, and then we'll just run our tests again. We'll go back to the test that was failing, and we should hopefully have a console log as to what's going on. And it's got a promise. Okay, so what we're actually missing here is an await, because that's an asynchronous task to insert into the database. Let's run it again. So it's failing again, and the reason it's failing is it's It's failing because of this. So let's have a look and see if we can just grab another different assertion that's going to give us to equal. Let's have a look. Oh, what we can do actually is, let's just go back to our handler unit tests. We can assert that the token is actually this one, because that's a token that was returned. Oops, that one. And then we can do expect res.user to equal, and then we'll just pass in user. Let's rerun our tests, and we've got passing tests, and we've got 100% test coverage. So what we've got now with the unit tests that we've generated here is we've got tests that confirm that if an email address doesn't match somebody in our database, or if the password doesn't match that user, then those tests will fail. And if that all succeeds, then we get an assertion that the expected response from our function is the one that we're expecting to be returned. So we've now got decent test coverage on this, and we've fixed the failing test from the last videos as well. So what we'll do is we'll wrap the video up there. In the next video, we'll take a look at implementing the root for this Authenticate user, so that we've got a new root that will exist within our root file. But for now, I hope the video has been informative, and I'll see you next time.